Hey sailors, welcome to the crew. I'm Sailor Janda, and this is Janda's All the World's Fighting Ships 1920 special. Um, First things first, I made a save in January of 1920 to use for this. I know I made it. I looked back and checked the video to make sure I did. I did. But I can't find it now, so we're using this November 1920 save. It shouldn't be radically different. Anyway, as with the previous few specials, we're going to go over the various ships that are now in service across the world and see what's going on in the world's navies. We're now in sort of the late or peak dreadnought era. The world's navies have completely converted to dreadnought type ships. There are no pre dreadnoughts left in service. And it is sort of the very dawn of naval aviation as well. Now, the US has Britain has the largest navy in the world. The US has the third largest navy in the world behind Germany and Britain at this point. France and Russia have begun to fall a bit behind the big three. And Japan is starting to catch up more and more to a certain extent. Italy was very strong in the pre dreadnought era, but it's fallen behind now. Spain is Spain, but they do have a surprising number of dreadnoughts, actually. So, let's take a look at what we've got. Starting with destroyers, there are a lot of destroyers in service, but it's definitely less than there were in previous dates. Older destroyers are being decommissioned, and they're not being replaced with as numerous of destroyers. Now, my destroyer fleet has gone from very modern to very obsolete, actually, in a lot of ways. But take Spain, for instance, only has 28 destroyers, but all of their destroyers are now 1,100 tons and up. The Bustamante class here makes 30 knots, two 4-inch guns, and 6 torpedo tubes, apparently. I can't quite. Sorry. Can't quite tell from here how they're laid out, but might be 2 triple centerline tubes, which would be quite a bit of firepower. Then they have the 1,400 ton Suita class, 32 knots, 3 5-inch guns, and probably also 2 triple torpedo tubes, unless it's single tubes. Again, it's hard to see on these diagrams, but something like that. And then the modern 1,500 ton Jose Luis Diaz class, which has 3 5-inch guns and 9 torpedo tubes, probably 3 triple tubes if I had to guess. They've also built one off with 4-inch guns, less torpedoes, but also mines, which is just weird, but yeah. Austria-Hungary has barely a more numerous destroyer force with 29, but it is a lot older, as they still have a lot of old 500-ton types, which only make 27 knots and have 3 and 2-inch guns in service. However, they themselves also have a pretty substantial number of 1,100 tonners with 5-inch guns and 9 tubes. Some of these other 1,100 tonners with 4-inch guns and only 6 tubes, but mines, and this Dinara class with 1,300 tons, 4-inch guns, 6 tubes, and also mines. The Austrians have a lot with a lot of mines, which sort of makes sense for the Adriatic, and they're building a 1,500-ton class now. Spain has... No, I've looked at Spain. Sorry. Italy has 53 destroyers, which is actually the second most out of anybody in the world now. But the force is a bit obsolete. They have a 400-tonner still. They have quite a number of these 500-ton destroyers with 1 3-inch, 4 2-inch guns and only make 26 knots. Some of these very fast 700-tonners that make 31 knots and have 3 4-inch guns but only 2 torpedo tubes. And then more recently, they've begun building these 1,500-tonners with 4-inch guns, 6 torpedo tubes, and mines that make 33 knots. Or, alternatively, this version, which has 2 5-inch guns and makes 32 knots with 9 torpedo tubes. Although the core of their fleet now is, they have these 14 and 1,500-tonners with 2 up to 4, or 2 up to 3 4-inch guns, 6 torpedo tubes. and a lot of mines. Sorry, I don't know why I'm yawning so much here. Japan has 33 destroyers, which is a lot less. Wow, they have actually, by tonnage, Japan is the smallest destroyer force in the world. I think they've lost a lot in the wars they've fought with me. Oh, interestingly, they have an aviation force pretty much more than these others I've looked at. Well, yeah. The AI has a little more aviation than I thought they did. Japan still has a lot of old 500 tonners, which are all pretty much to the same couple of basic blueprints that we've seen before. And then they have some of these 800 tonners, which make 29 knots, 2 4-inch guns, 4 torpedo tubes, and 6 mines. They have the. Oh, here, this one's named Kamikaze. It's a bit unfortunate in hindsight, but it is Imperial Japan, so it makes sense. The Harakaze class, 2 5-inch guns, 9 torpedo tubes, and they have a version with 6 torpedo tubes that also has mines. A lot of people going with mine destroyers. I don't know if the AI will always do that, or if it's something that I've triggered with my mine-equipped destroyer classes, to be honest. I mean, at this point, depth charges would really make more sense, but who knows? France has 49 destroyers, which is quite a fleet, slightly less tonnage than mine. And I say mine is outdated, and it is, but to be fair, still what? By tonnage, it's actually only the fourth largest behind Britain, Russia, and Italy, but fourth largest is not so bad. Anyway, France has 49. They have a lot of 1,100 ton. Honestly, they are mostly 1,300 ton plus, except for these couple of 1,100 tonners, 2 4-inch guns, 4 torpedo tubes. They have an early 1,500 ton class with 2 5-inch guns, 34 knots, 6 torpedo tubes, and then a bunch of 1,400 tonners with 3 4-inch guns, 31 knots, 6 torpedo tubes, and mines. More recently, they've built these, which have. I'm guessing the depth charge throwers and the AA are the main thing these gain, because otherwise I would say they're just in. Oh, they're not faster also. Okay. Well, not than all of them, though. Hard to say. Russia. Russia has the second biggest destroyer force in the world by tonnage, which means those 44 destroyers they have are very modern. They do have a few old 5 and 600 tonners in service still, but the bulk of the fleet consists of 1,100 tons plus at least. These Buinis have 4 4-inch guns, 32 knots, and they make, and 4 torpedo tubes. The Zvoy class here are weird as they have 2 6-inch guns for their only armament. They make 32 knots, 6 torpedo tubes, and mines. Everybody's got depth charge throwers and such too. I do really need to update my destroyer fleet, but I kind of knew that. I've just been trying to get my capital ships finalized. The Verney class, 2 4-inch, 32 knots. These are, well, they're lighter and cheaper. And to be fair, 4-inch guns might even be better for engaging other destroyers, but bit of an odd downgrade to make, really. The Gremyashis here are more traditional destroyer, 32 knots, 3 5-inch guns, and 3 triple torpedo tubes, I believe. And then they have some of these 3 4-inch guns, 6 torpedo tube types with mines. A lot of people building destroyers with a lot of mines, more than I put on any mine. The U.S. has 50 destroyers currently that we are building the Lawrence class more of, which will be done soon. Honestly, ours is probably the most outdated destroyer force in the world on average at this point, which it's interesting to me that we still have so much tonnage for not that many more ships than a lot of people. Like, France has 1 ship left. Oh, you know what? That tonnage includes the new builds. Yeah, so we actually are quite outdated at this point. The U.S. fleet includes, well, a couple of these 500-ton Draytons, but they will be gone soon. Quite a few of these 600-ton Cummings, and it will be a little while before they're all phased out. The modern core of the fleet, to be fair, we have these 700-ton Cassins, which do make 30 knots, so they're not hopeless. They just don't have the very latest in torpedo armament, as they only have 4 tubes. And the same, unfortunately, is true of the Gwyn class at 900 tons, which has a pretty good gun armament of 4 4-inch and 2 2-inch guns and makes 31 knots, which is respectable still. But only 4 torpedo tubes. Our only really modern class of destroyers, honestly, are the Lawrence class with 3 4-inch, 2 3-inch guns, 33 knots, and 3 triple torpedo tubes. These are lacking depth charge throwers, so they could still be improved probably, but in all other regards, they're probably equal or superior to all the other destroyers we've seen. We just need to get more of them in commission, which 12, I believe, are under construction at this very moment, so that's being worked on at least. Germany, as the world's second largest fleet, has 51 destroyers, but interestingly, not has less tonnage than the U.S. Isn't, and they also have a couple of 500 tonners and a lot of these 600-ton V69 class, which just have 2 3-inch guns, 26 knots, and 4 tubes. And then they replaced that, interestingly, with a succession of the V2, V6, V27, V30, S35, G39, a whole succession of these classes, but they're all 11 classes, the 2 5-inch guns and 4 torpedo tubes, making 32 knots. They replaced that with 3 4-inch guns and 6 torpedo tubes at some point, and then they had a class that managed to have that slower at 29 knots, but 8 torpedo tubes. And then they got the 3 5-inch guns back with 8 torpedo tubes and 30 knots. Apparently now they're back down to 3 4-inch guns, so they're oscillating a little, or improving what they can do with 1,100 tons, but for some reason they refuse to build anything bigger than 1,100 tons. Now, Britain has the largest destroyer force in the world by both numbers and tonnage, with 57 and at over 75,000 tons of destroyers. At this point, they do still have a few 5, 6, 700-ton destroyers in service themselves, but not a lot. Almost all of their fleet is either the 1,100-ton Star, Kale, and Bat types, which the earliest class has 4 4-inch guns, 4 torpedo tubes, and 32 knots. They replaced that with one with 6 torpedo tubes and 3 4-inch guns, and then one with 8 torpedo tubes, as they presumably gained in torpedo tech. This is probably 2 quadruple tubes, if I had to guess. Up from 2 triple, probably. Then they started to build a 1,500-ton types, finally, which, oddly enough, the Dunes, I think their major advantage is that they're faster at 33 knots, but otherwise they don't look like too much of an improvement from the Bats. I mean, they're down, well, they have the 3 4-inch guns, they're down to 6 torpedo tubes, so yeah. But they got back up to 3 5-inch guns with first 6, and now their more recent ones, 3 5-inch guns and 8 torpedo tubes with 32 knot speeds. Although the very recent most class, in order to get 33 knots, is back down to 3 4-inch guns and 6 torpedo tubes. But something like this or this is the most modern destroyer type commonly around in the world. With 3 4-inch guns, 6 to 8 torpedo tubes. I think that the U.S. Lawrence class can definitely fight and win against it. It's just a question of, anti-submarine effectiveness we're a little lacking in, and numbers of new destroyers. Now, light cruisers. These are a class that's at least starting to see a bit of a renaissance, and I have to admit the U.S. has fallen behind here a bit as well. That's sort of the next priority as soon as our current construction is finished. But Spain currently has 4 light cruisers in service, and it's actually built all of them quite recently, only 4 years ago, albeit the Infanta Isabel class, which is all 4 of them, are not exactly what you'd call terrifying. They are fast, yes. At 30 knots, they're about, honestly, a good 8 to 10 knots faster than some of the American cruisers. However, they're only armed with 3 5-inch guns and a 1-inch belt, which means that in an actual. Yes, the 3 5-inch guns are at least all centerline, which is something. Even so, even the oldest American light cruisers would pretty much tear these to pieces um, in any sort of head on engagement. 3 5-inch guns is literally the firepower of a destroyer. Literally, because right here is a Spanish 1,400-ton destroyer with 3 5-inch guns. Why they thought it was appropriate to take this armament and put it on a ship more than 3 times the size, almost 4 times the size, I have no idea. But it was not appropriate. These are almost useless because of how weak that armament is. They do have a lot of mines, so that's something. So that's a bad start to the AI's revival of their light cruiser programs, actually. Austria-Hungary now has 5 light cruisers. Some of them, well, 2 of them are the older Aspern class, which these with 26 knots and 6 5-inch guns, and they're not all centerline. I'm going to maintain these are actually also severely underarmed, although at least they can run away from my light cruisers, but they are underarmed. More recently, they've built the 3 Novara class vessels. These are quite a lot nicer. 5 6-inch guns on the center line, plus 2 3-inch guns just for good measure, 29 knots, 2-inch belt. This is sort of the baseline for what a modern light cruiser probably ought to look like. It's fast enough to keep up with or run away from battle cruisers. It's obviously much faster than older light cruisers, and although it has less guns, the fact that they're all centerline, realistically, this cruiser could probably beat almost any light cruiser in American service. Maybe not the very latest, like Tacoma class, but that would be a tough fight. It would definitely beat a Chicago or something, just because of the difference in other technologies aside from just gun size. Italy is up to 6 light cruisers now. One of them, the Quatit, is a 5-inch gun-armed light cruiser, which only makes 21 knots and is from a good 15, 17 years ago. So this is not anything special. It was not good when it was built, and it still isn't. They followed that with the Lombardia class, Liguria and Tripoli. These at least have a secondary armament with 8 3-inch guns, and they're a touch faster at 23 knots. To tell the truth, these were also bad when they were built, and they're still bad now. There's almost destroyers now in 1920 that could not actually win a gunfight with these, but a couple of destroyers probably could gang up on and sink one of these in a gunfight now. Their very most modern class is the Irid class, Irid Dugally and Eurydice. Now, these are quite a bit nicer. It looks like they have 4 centerline 6-inch guns, plus 2 on the sides, 29 knots, 2-inch belts. These are what I would call the only actually modern light cruisers Italy has. Not that they are... Sorry, I dropped something here. So. Right, so. These are the only actually modern light cruisers that Italy has, in all probability. They are very solid, I would say. Nothing exceptional. Actually, I really want to compare real quick. How do I think they would fare against these? I actually think that despite being much more efficiently laid out and cheaper, that these basic modern light cruiser designs with 5 guns to a side would not fare especially well against my Tacoma class, which effectively has, I believe, 7 guns to a side effectively, plus a thicker belt, even if slightly slower. So my most modern cruisers are actually still very comparable to everyone else's, although the US does have its fair share of outdated cruisers, but so does the AI so far. We'll see what the really major powers have. Japan next. Yeah, Japan only has 2 light cruisers actually in its fleet. It's building more, although not large ones. But its entire fleet right now consists of Tsushima and Unebi. These have 10 5-inch guns. They make 28 knots, 1.5-inch belt. They're fast, of course, which is a big improvement from anything that doesn't make a speed like this. But although, of course, they'll be modern 5-inch guns, their firepower is still seriously lacking to the point that I would call this more of an anti-destroyer cruiser than a proper cruiser. These aren't really outstanding, even for the tonnage that they're at. France. France is one of the 4 powers. Well, Germany, Britain, and France are the only AI powers, at least, that have built up a really substantial light cruiser fleet. France has 9 of the things in service. One of them is the old Suchet, which is a pretty classic, sort of a, it's sort of in a transitional period from, what was it, 1907? Yeah, it's got 10 6-inch guns with 6 to a side, in effect, 2.5-inch belt, and it makes 25 knots, which is more than what came before it, but not enough to keep up with the most modern cruisers. So it's a bit of a compromised design in that regard, where it probably could have had more armament if it didn't get that speed, but that speed is enough to keep it ahead of anything, most of its generation at least. So this is not a bad design, it's just showing its age now. After that, they built Amiral Cécile and Davout, and these are abysmal. Now, they are the first French cruisers to make 22 knots, but they're only 3,500 tons, and they have 2 5-inch guns. Frankly, they're all but useless. I don't even know what they're supposed to do. There are literally destroyers in the French Navy that outgun this ship significantly, because that outgun it and have way more torpedoes than it. This design was horribly, horribly compromised in order to make it to 28 knots, I can only assume, because if not for its sheer size allowing it to absorb fire, to be fair, France doesn't have any destroyers with 5-inch guns, but, well, it has a couple of early ones, but that's only more damning, really. The fact that this early 1,500-ton destroyer is faster and equally well-armed in guns and has more torpedo tubes than the Amiral Cécile's. This ship was... Clearly, France did not really have the tech to build a 28-knot ship, at least not on this displacement, and this ship really suffered for it. More recently, they have the Forbin class, Forbin, Coët-Legon, Surcouf, and Alger, at 5,000 tons, 4 6-inch centerline guns, plus 2 3-inch guns, a 3.5-inch belt, 28 knots. The Forbin class is quite solid, actually. Not outstanding. I mean, I think 5 6-inch guns centerline is probably more the standard for this generation of light cruisers. So it's maybe a little undergunned, but it's also pretty light. It's got the speed. It's not a bad cruiser all around. It's probably at least a match for most of the American cruisers. Probably not the Tacomas, though. Their most recent design, the Islay class, which has 4 centerline and 2 side 6-inch guns, so effectively 5 to a side. Makes 29 knots, 2-inch belt. Has some above-water torpedo tubes, which is a good boost of firepower, to be fair. I'm actually not sure that they do have a chance to detonate on deck in the game, but I think they might, to be honest. And of course, you have to get relatively close to use them still. But this isn't a bad... this is a solid cruiser design. The Isleys here could be quite dangerous. Obviously, they only have 2 of them, but they're getting quite a bit out of 5,400 tons, so I gotta give them credit for that. Now, the U.S. fleet consists of 4 Chicago, 4 Olympia, and 4 Tacoma class. The Chicago class, as has recently been pointed out, and I can only agree, are ancient. They're literally a pre-generated design. They've been remodeled since then, refitted a couple times, but they still only have 10 6-inch guns with effectively, to be fair, effectively 7 to a side, which is not bad, but they're old guns, I believe. And 8 2-inch guns, 2-inch belt. The fact they only make 22 knots, they're not at all modern ships. They would be pretty much mincemeat for. I'm not going to say for every AI cruiser, because I've seen a lot of AI cruisers just going through so far that were armed with only 5-inch guns or very small numbers of guns that, honestly, despite inferior speed and older guns, the Shikoku class would probably still have a pretty good fighting chance against. But yes, the most modern light cruisers that make 28 knots and have 5 centerline 6-inch guns, 2 or 3 generations newer, would definitely chew through a Shikoku. That is why they're on foreign station duty, of course, but yes, they're obsolete and need to be replaced. The same is largely true of their successor, Olympia class, which has a heavier secondary armament and a bit thicker armor, but otherwise basically the same antiquated design issue. The only really modern American cruisers are the Fort Tacomas, which are still not the most modern because they don't actually have. Well, they have 4 centerline 6-inch guns with twin turrets, but they don't have the rest. Still, they effectively have 7 6-inch guns to a side, plus a couple of 4-inch guns, I guess 4. 3-inch belt, 28 knots. These aren't efficient, which is their main issue. They're 7,900 tons, where other countries are starting to get the same effective combat power out of more like, 5,600, 5,400 tons? So they definitely, I shouldn't build more of these. I should build a lighter replacement class, probably. That said, for actual combat value, the Tacomas are still very much worth keeping around, even though the design is over 10 years old now. I haven't actually seen anything that I would be confident of beating a Tacoma yet. However, maybe. I skipped Russia, didn't I? Okay. Let's see what Russia has. Russia has 5 light cruisers in its fleet, which isn't a whole lot. Now, to be fair, although the Americans are a bit obsolete, they do still have the second most tonnage and the equal most actual cruisers. Russia only has 5 light cruisers, which 2 are the small 4,500-ton Palata class, 25 knots, which is not bad, and 2.5-inch belt, which is not bad, but the 10 5-inch guns really sort of lets it down as an armament against other cruisers. This would have been pretty terrifying, probably against destroyers that were built in 1907, but against modern destroyers can run away from it quite easily. And cruisers with 6-inch guns will tear it to shreds, so I wouldn't call it a great class. However, what Russia does have most recently, the 3 Avroras, Avrora, Pamyat, Mercuria, and Svetlana, and these are pretty mean. 28 knots, 7,900 tons, 4 centerline 6-inch guns in twin turrets, plus 5 on each side. So effectively 9 guns to a side, which is more than a Tacoma class of the same weight. 3-inch belt, 8 4-inch guns. These are arguably, in some ways, they're not that modern because they don't have that many centerline gun mounts. But the amount of firepower they bring to bear, combined with their speed and armor, makes these probably the most powerful fighting light cruisers in the seas at this moment. They're definitely very formidable. All right, then Germany has the equal most light cruisers in the seas with 12. Now, 5 of these are the Hella class from 1906. They make 24 knots, which is really starting to get, it's faster than my Legacy light cruisers, so most of the U.S. fleet, but not that much faster, and they're much slower than the proper new generation. 3-inch belt is good. 10 5-inch guns is not good, so these are very questionable as modern cruisers. Really, they're not outstanding. However, they are better than their immediate successor, Thetis, which was same as one of the French designs, I believe. They managed to get 28 knots. At what cost? Pretty much everything, because it has no actual combat value whatsoever, basically. They followed that with Amazon, which is almost exactly the same problems. Apparently, it has a half-inch belt of armor, which is basically none. It has 3 5-inch guns. That's a little better, but this thing is still honestly barely capable of taking on a destroyer or two in a gunfight, let alone other cruisers. Speed is sort of life, but it's not everything. Then Medusa and Arcona, 5,300 tons. These have speed, I'd say average armor. 10 5-inch guns, again, though, really kind of lets them down as far as firepower goes. Perfectly adequate, at least, against destroyers, but not as good as a 6-inch or more armed cruiser. However, they're at least fast, so they're clearly better than the Hela class, but they're not even that fast at 27 knots for the modern generation. Their most recent class, Berlin, München, and Lubeck, these are their actual modern cruisers, 5,400 tons, 5 6-inch and 2 3-inch guns, 3-inch belt, 29 knots. This is the prototype sort of late teens cruiser that we've seen from a couple of other countries, and yeah, these are quite effective. These are probably what the U.S. needs to build next, basically. Maybe slightly heavier, superior in some way, but those are a solid design. And finally, Britain, which has 10 light cruisers in service, but does have the most tonnage by a narrow margin, because, as usual, Britain builds big. They have the 3 old Comus class light cruisers, Champion, Cleopatra, and Caracoa. And these are just some of the most heavily armed light cruisers by number of guns ever built, with 12 6-inch and 16 4-inch guns. They managed to effectively bring eight guns to a side to bear 6-inch plus 8 4-inch. And with their belt and their speed, these are also very formidable fighting cruisers. 12 6, 16 4. Now, when I said that it's hard to judge for sure. I think I would take the Russian Aurora design because of its extra speed and extra set of 6-inch guns for long-ranged combat, but it's pretty much a toss-up between the two. I mean, if a Comus could get close to the Aurora, it would probably win, based on its 4-inch guns, so. This is also an extremely combat-effective light cruiser, even if it's a little older. They've then built the 3 Constance class, Constance Canada and Conquest, which are probably the first examples of well, they're still only 5 years old, but the first examples of the very modern 5 6-inch centerline guns, plus 4 3-inch guns, 2.5-inch belt, 28 knots. Your modern centerline gun-armed light cruiser. Everyone's piling a lot of mines onto their light cruisers. I don't know if there's really worth doing or not. However, after building these 3 good ships, they then wasted it by building the 4 and counting Carysfords, which at 5,300 tons only have 10 5-inch guns, 28 knots, 2-inch belt. Considering how many 5-inch gun-armed cruisers there are around in the world, apparently they'll survive, but they also went back from having 5 to only having 2 centerline turrets. They're not even twin turrets, so this just feels like a clear step backwards to me, and I have no idea why you would build these after building the Constance class. So overall, honestly, the picture in light cruisers is a little rosier than I thought it would be from the US perspective. The very sort of nastiest and most modern ships that the AI are building are these light cruisers armed with 5 6-inch centerline guns, which are definitely probably better, certainly from an economy point of view, than anything in the US fleet, but certainly aren't radically superior in actual combat. And a lot of the AI ships with only 5-inch guns and the like, despite being much more modern, are probably still inferior in one-on-one engagements to like 20-plus-year-old US light cruisers. Not that the US light cruiser force doesn't need replacing, but the AI is sort of mostly failing, with a few exceptions, to build designs that would really render the US light cruiser fleet obsolete. Now, heavy cruisers, largely as a result of the development of the battle cruiser, but heavy cruisers are almost a dead category. The US has 5 out of the, what, 12? 5 out of the 12 in the world belong to the United States. And even I converted one into a light carrier recently. Austria-Hungary. Did I talk about Austria-Hungary's light cruisers? Oh, yeah, I did. I remember talking about these, yeah. Austria-Hungary has one. Okay, Spain has 2 heavy cruisers. Pedro de Aragon and Alfonso XII, both the same class. And honestly, they're not terrible. 28 knots, 8 7-inch guns, 8 6-inch guns, 8 4-inch guns, a 4.5-inch belt. Now, for 13,600 tons and it being a heavy cruiser, it's actually not great, because I would really want to get at least 8-inch guns out of 13,600 tons. Yeah, in essence, I mean, okay, the US is building right now. Not finished yet, but all right. At what were those Spanish ones? The 13,600 tons. At 1,300 tons more than that, the US is building this, which has 8 9-inch guns. I would almost certainly rather have 8 9-inch guns than I would have plus 25-inch guns than I would have 8 7, 8 6, and 8 4. That's just a confusing. It's going to be hard for them to tell the difference between where their 7-inch and their 6-inch shells land. And that really is, I think, an issue that you can have in this game, because it's pretty good on details like that. Plus, it's just kind of really weird to have a primary and secondary armament that close in caliber. Also, I always forget what the front of the ship is in representations. I always want to think it's the other way. And I'm still not even confident looking at all these. I feel like the left side is forward. Yeah, it's not clear if you do something like this, though. Yeah. Okay, looking at this destroyer design, it actually is clear. The left side is forward. Or if I look at not this, my one little aviation ship. Yeah, left is forward. So the reason that's relevant is that these have all of their guns, or almost all. 6 out of their 8 7-inch guns are on the stern. Now, a Nelson-type configuration with all of the guns forward is about in period and would be interesting and plausible. Putting all your guns at the stern is just weird and bad. I think it's just bad. I mean, unless Spain just intends to spend all of its time running away, which would be like France meme level planning, like, why would you do that? I don't understand that design at all. I'm not saying that it's useless, but I think Spain could have laid a ship out a lot better for 13,600 tons, to be honest. Probably just to have 8-inch guns, even, would have just made it a better ship. Right. Then Austria-Hungary has one armored cruiser, Minerva, which has four 10-inch guns, 14 6-inch guns, four 3-inch guns, dual purpose, 5-inch belt, 28 knots. It's not hopeless, but it's a little. The four 10-inch guns, for instance, are going to be definitely outclassed by eight 9-inch guns because the difference between calibers isn't that huge. But the 10-inch guns will hit hard. I would definitely probably take this over the Spanish design we just saw. It's a little more rationally laid out. Well, maybe not definitely. Having only four guns compared to eight is still a pretty big compromise. But the size of the guns does partially make up for it, and it's fast and decently armored. I wouldn't call the Minerva terrible, but I'm not going to call it great either, just because it only has two twin turrets for primary armament, which is pre-dreadnought stuff, basically. Then we have, who else even has? Italy. Italy has two armored cruisers, small ones. Giuseppe Garibaldi. I don't know. 9,100 tons, 20 knots, four 8-inch, 12 6-inch, 8 3-inch guns. This is actually just an armored cruiser of the old era, which I still have several of in service, so I can't really criticize, but it's a pretty average armor. It's definitely obsolete now. Obviously, the other designs we've just seen, albeit much larger, would rip them to pieces. What they've just built is Ancona at 11,600 tons. Six 8-inch guns and three twin turrets, 8 6-inch, 12 4-inch, 28 knots, 4.5-inch belt. Ancona, I mean, really, just stick a fourth 8-inch turret on, first of all, but it's at least got three. I'm not totally sure how combat effective it would be. I don't think it's terrible, especially considering it's lighter than the Spanish and Austro-Hungarian designs and therefore cheaper. I don't think it's terrible, but I don't think it's amazing either. It's just a little quirky and probably pretty average for what it's trying to be, which is a modern heavy cruiser. And then Japan has one in service as well, but is building two more. However, what they have in service currently is Mikuma, which is an old armored cruiser design, the Alba class. And frankly, with 14 6-inch guns, she was a little undergunned for an armored cruiser even at the time she was built. Now, the lack of big guns is still really hurting her, and the speed is really hurting her, so she's not very useful, to be honest. However, I will be interested to see what they're building with this Iwate class, I should mention. The Iwate and Tokiwa are 16,600 tons, which is like first-generation battlecruiser type stuff. Those could be fairly scary, actually. That could be a proper design Japan's building there. And the very last AI heavy cruiser in service is with France, Guidon. These are very similar to that Italian design. A little slower at 27 knots, but four 10-inch guns, 14 6-inch, 12 4-inch, 4.5-inch belt. Again, the 10-inch guns will hit hard, and the 6-inch guns will back them up well. I should say, to be fair, against any light cruiser in service, this will just shred it, of course, which is sort of the goal of a heavy cruiser. If it can catch it, which is not really guaranteed at only 27 knots, but it will shred it. However, it's much more expensive, and I do think, something with 8-inch guns and a couple less 6-inch guns would probably be a much better overall design, so I'm not terribly convinced by it. Now, the U.S. has 5 of the 12 heavy cruisers in the world. However, I should admit, the U.S. has 5 armored cruisers still in service, is what it has. 3 Memphis class, which make 22 knots, 6 8-inch, 10 6-inch guns. These are a match for any of the other armored cruisers left in service in the world, and they provide some very helpful firepower to back up our light cruisers. However, they're absolutely mincemeat if they ever run into a battle cruiser, and I'm well aware of that. To the point that they are almost a liability, but I don't think they are quite yet a liability. I guess this war will show the truth of it. Maybe they are. The San Diegos are improved on that, but not radically different. Now, of course, the U.S. is building two Brooklyn-class heavy cruisers, which are proper 28-knot heavy cruisers with 9-inch guns, 6-inch belt, etc. These, I have no doubt in my mind, will be the most powerful heavy cruisers in the world when completed, with the possible exception of those 16,000-ton things Japan was building. I am curious about those now. But these, I think, are capable of actually revitalizing the class of heavy cruisers. They're fast enough to run away from, or at least keep pace with battle cruisers, and also well enough armed and armored to shred light cruisers or pretty much any other heavy cruiser in existence. So although the heavy cruiser force of the U.S. is heavily outdated now, first of all, it's still... I don't think it was worth all the AI decommissioning all their ships without replacement, because I think even the old and obsolete ones, even if they are meat for battle cruisers, are potentially quite helpful against light cruisers until they're replaced. But in any case, the two new ships the U.S. is building should pretty much give us, with the possible exception of Japan, an actually modern heavy cruiser force capable of ripping everybody else's heavy and light cruisers to shreds. Now let's take a look at the world's fledgling aviation forces, such as they are. Most of these are not going to be terribly exceptional. I know it says there's one CVL. There isn't a dedicated tab for whatchamacallit, aviation ships, as they call them, or basically seaplane carriers for the most part at this point. We can't see how many naval aircraft everybody has. The answer is not very many. The world record is currently France with 35 total aircraft in service. It's very much a fledgling arm. And the U.S., as you can see, has the only carrier that can actually launch and recover aircraft at sea on a deck. So the only flight deck-equipped ship in existence. Austria-Hungary has a grand total of... Although airships, however, very popular with the AI. And first of all, already rapidly becoming obsolete if they aren't already by 1920. And not really a threat at all to the U.S., considering the sort of distances involved in trying to scout anywhere we'd be fighting. If we were in the North Sea, they might be a little more relevant, but not for the United States. Now, Austria-Hungary has 5 aircraft in service, and these are all from the seaplane carrier Rosalia L. All these seaplane carriers, I mean, they have slightly different armaments and weights and speeds, maybe, but I think they're all pretty much identical at 5 aircraft carried. The U.S. also has one, the Speed, which has a single token 5-inch gun, which floats somewhere in front of the ship, plus 22 knots, and carries 5 aircraft. I forget, can I see anything about the... I can see what I know about aircraft types, so... Austria has the Loner 11, probably the 10 is their actual one, with 80 speed, 2 firepower. The U.S.'s fighter has 100 speed, 2 firepower, although I can see that in exact detail here. So, yeah, they're not exactly correct, but the intel stuff there is like an approximation based on what we can guess about them from public reports. We know that our Boeing Buffalo makes 97 knots, has a range of about 55 nautical miles, and has 2 firepower. All right, so that's the... for the purpose of this, it's got basically speed 100, firepower 2, like it lists here. Which means it's probably considerably superior to any of Austria's fighters. Although maybe their float plane scouts are fast enough to outrun it, which is interesting. Spain has a total of 9 aircraft in service, which comes from apparently come from ground facilities because they don't have any actual ship-based aviation of any kind, unless I'm missing something here. Yeah, it must all be from ground facilities. Italy has 14 aircraft in service, which come from ground facilities and the seaplane carrier Camasio. She's a pretty bog standard seaplane carrier. Well, she is fast at 27 knots, which would be something to commend, except for the fact that that means she's 5,200 tons, whereas the American one is 1,600, and that's pretty similar to what the Austro-Hungarian one was. So this is, for just carrying 5 seaplanes, yeah, she's fast, but this is outrageously, like, Italy has spent far too much money on this for what it does. Japan has 25 aircraft, so they're taking the whole development pretty seriously, and yeah, they have 5 seaplane carriers in actual service. They are basically all the same for all practical intents and purposes, even though there's 3 different classes. 6 4-inch guns, 5 aircraft. They apparently vary from 19 to 25 knots for that one. So they didn't spend too much on tonnage, so that's not too bad. But yeah, they're all basically the same ship. They have 25 aircraft on 5 seaplane carriers. France has 35 aircraft. They do have the record. However, that must be entirely from land bases because they have no seagoing ships actually carrying aircraft. They are building, however, the 8,700-ton aviation vessel Ville du Havre. The fact that that's not a light carrier suggests to me that they're hugely overspending on a seaplane carrier, but we'll see, I guess. Russia has 25 naval aircraft, which come from a land base and the seaplane carrier Vilna, which again is pretty extremely standard. We'll get to the U.S. in a second because we're the only ones with a carrier. Germany has 20 naval aircraft, which come from land base and the seaplane carrier Gebrüder Jürgens, which is again extremely standard. And Britain has a total of 5 naval aircraft, which are all based on the experimental seaplane carrier Baron Blantyre, which again is an extremely standard seaplane carrier. Most of them are a bit faster than the US one, but there's nothing special about any of them. The only flight deck equipped vessel in the world as of this moment is USS San Diego, which is a converted armored cruiser. Her armament's been reduced to just 2.5 and 4 3-inch guns, and I didn't bother to redo her looks here, so you can't. You're just gonna have to imagine the flight deck. Obviously, it's a waste of tonnage having all this belt armor and so on, and she only makes 24 knots, which isn't outstanding. But it's fast enough to run away from dreadnoughts, at least, or to keep with dreadnoughts, which is where she's intended to operate, just directly with the battle fleet at this point, or behind it. And she carries 14 aircraft, so she's got the only actual fighters and torpedo bombers at sea at the moment, which consist of the Boeing Buffalo and the Martin Mars B. Although, actually, I was introducing the Lockheed Lodestar to replace the Buffalo. That's right, because of maneuverability, toughness, and range. I didn't really look at aircraft types for everybody else, I guess, in the end, despite what I was talking about. Spain's are their fighter allegedly has 0 firepower. That's probably a lie, but I doubt it's too far behind ours. We're pretty early in the game. Italy's Machi M65B is too slow. Oh, but the very newest Italian fighters are pretty similar to ours. The Caproni CA67B and the Machi M72. Japan's fighter, the Kawasaki Kyofu, is horribly low on speed, allegedly. Japan has the Polikarpov, or not Japan, Russia's Polikarpov PO-10 is quite similar. France's Breguet 44 is a little slow. Britain's Supermarine Shark, also a little slow, but it's hard to say for sure. Germany's Henschel HS-86B probably doesn't actually have firepower 0, but I guess you never know. Anyway, that brings us around to the current Kings of the Ocean. If the Naval Air Arm is extremely fledgling, right now the ocean is dominated by dreadnought battleships and battle cruisers. Battleships are a lot more numerous than battle cruisers, but battle cruiser forces are pretty prominent in most of the world's navies. Spain has one single battle cruiser, the Reina Cristina. Now, when she was first built in 1908, she was already not really very good, but at this point, this is a floating target. In 1920, Reina Cristina is nothing more than a floating target. She makes 22 knots, which is hugely slower than any of the real battle cruisers around, of which there's now quite a lot. Her 6-inch belt is mediocre, and most importantly, her 4 12-inch guns are pathetic. I mean, it's a pre-dreadnought's armament. This is a faster than average pre-dreadnought with less armor, and it shows. This is not really even a battle cruiser. It would be slaughtered by most of the battle cruisers in the world, including any of mine, even the most outdated ones. Even Congress here would pretty comprehensively take Reina Cristina apart, I am fairly confident of. Austria-Hungary actually has 2 battle cruisers, to their credit. Kärnten and Tyrol from back in 1910. They're only sort of half battle cruisers themselves. In fact, they're not really much any better than the Spanish design. With 8 12-inch guns, yes, but because of the wing turret thing that you can see here, they only have 6 bearing to each side. A 4.5-inch belt is extremely thin even for a battle cruiser, and 23 knots is not fast enough. So again, these are sort of not just mincemeat to the most modern battle cruisers, which they are, but also there are 1912, 10 era battle cruisers that are much better than this. I'm guessing they didn't have 3 centerline turrets, certainly not 4, but that's not really an excuse. And yeah, my thing without 4 centerline turrets, the Lexington, or rather Congress is the only one that's left, but she's a lot faster. She's got much better belt armor, and she's got at least the same firepower. I would be fairly confident of beating these with my oldest battle cruiser, let alone my new ones. So Austria's fallen pretty behind in that race. Now, Italy, for whatever reason, has put every cent they've got into battle cruisers instead of battleships. They barely even have a battleship force. As you can see, they have 2, which is hugely less than everyone else. They've made up for it, at least in their own minds, by building the 4th largest battle cruiser force in the world with 7, and another one on the way. The oldest 3 of these are Lepanto, Francesco Morosini, and Attilio Regolo. 20,400 tons. They make 27 knots, 8 12-inch and 16 5-inch guns, and a 6-inch belt. Now, because of their speed, these are at least actual battle cruisers. However, obviously they still only bring 6 guns to a side to bear, which makes them more of a semi-battle cruiser like my Congress, and again much inferior to any of the really modern battle cruisers being built by the major naval powers, or later in the era. I'm not saying they're hopelessly useless, because at least they're fast enough, but this is definitely a well below average battle cruiser. And they followed that with 4 Italia class of 27,000 tons. And these make 28 knots. They have 8 12-inch guns in 4 twin turrets, 14 4-inch, 4 3-inch, a 12-inch belt. There's no obvious flaws with the Italia class, and I must credit them for that. Their gun layout, it's clearly not superimposed guns, which means it's not really very weight or targeting efficient. It's not great, but it's not. I mean, at least it's actually 8 12-inch guns that bear to either side, like a proper dreadnought. And the belt is quite impressive. I rarely see the AI put a really good amount of armor on its ships, but that's battleship grade armor on this battle cruiser. If anything, I wonder whether they would have been better off cutting a little out of that and getting like 14-inch guns on this, because this is a 1914 ship, which is when I started building 14-inch gun ships. But yet I didn't have any 14-inch battle cruisers until 1916, but still in all, I mean, they finished the last of these in 1916. And the issue is just that, of course, the Italias have been sort of left behind by. They're not absolutely fantastic even for when they were built, and they're being very rapidly sort of left behind because by now, first of all, the near contemporary Saratoga class, which finished with or right after the last of them were finished, much superior. Yes, slightly less deck armor, but the 14-inch guns are going to hit a lot harder. So you would definitely take the Saratoga over the Italia, and for only 2,000 more tons at that. Now the question is, can they keep up with the new generation? And the answer might be yes, because they're building Francesco Caracci. I can't tell you what the last part of it is, but Francesco Caracci something, and that's 37,300 tons apparently, which is very comparable. It's actually heavier than the new American Constellation class. So if Italy's building, say, a 16-inch gunned battlecruiser right now, they might be keeping up. Their battlecruiser force is not terrible. It's not great either. However, the fatal flaw with it is that apparently it cost them every penny they've got, because they don't have a battleship force, really. They have 2 battleships, and they're both smaller than all of their battlecruisers. But we'll come back to that. Japan has 3 battlecruisers in service, and they're all pretty solid, actually. They're all second-generation types. Tsukuma and Kurama have 8 14-inch guns, 16 6-inch and 8 3-inch. They make 25 knots, 8.5-inch belt. So these are proper second-generation type battlecruisers, even though I think they're the first Japanese generation. The 8 14-inch guns is very competitive. The 25 knots is a little slow. I would have taken the 6-inch gun secondaries down to 5-inch and just gotten an extra knot or 2 of speed or more belt armor, which is not bad for a battlecruiser, but not great overall. And then they followed that up with Congo, which does resolve one of my, at the cost of only apparently 900 more tons. I don't see what else they changed. I don't really see anything else they changed, but somehow, at the cost of another 900 tons, they managed to get her up to 28 knots, which makes her much more competitive. Congo is a very dangerous battlecruiser. My only qualm, personally, is the armor, but in reality, that's going to be competitive with the vast majority of the battlecruisers in the world. So this is a pretty formidable battlecruiser overall. Not to interrupt this again, but it has begun raining, and I have windows open, so I'll be back in just a second. Maybe I'll cut this. Probably I'll be too lazy. Okay. I probably will cut that, actually. That took a while. So anyway, next on the list, I guess, was Russia. Yeah. No, France. France has only 2 battlecruisers. They've sort of gone the opposite way of Spain. They've managed to maintain a very competitive dreadnought fleet. In fact, holy cow. Counting what's building, which is significant, of course, but France has the largest dreadnought fleet in the entire world, apparently. That's quite something. But they only have 2 battlecruisers, which is not many. And those would be Dunkirk and Strasbourg, both of the same class from 1909. They're proper first generation battlecruisers. And at the time they were built, they were not bad at all. The 8 12-inch guns with cross deck fire, 26 knots, 14 6-inch, 12 3-inch guns, which apparently they've refit to be dual purpose, 8-inch belt. For their time, these were quite nice. The fact that they have cross deck fire and only 12-inch guns means that in 1920, they're looking pretty obsolete, and 26 knots is definitely slower than the new generation of battlecruisers as well. But they're still not hopeless. I certainly wouldn't decommission them considering they're France's only battlecruisers. And in reality, they're probably still tougher than the American Congress, our oldest battlecruiser. But there's definitely much stronger battlecruisers out there now. Russia has 4 battlecruisers, which is probably a little bit better of a balance. Still a little light on the battlecruisers, but it has allowed them on a smaller budget to maintain a pretty competitive battleship force with Britain, for instance. Britain has actually gone overboard on battlecruisers compared to battleships, I have to say, but we'll get to that. Russia has 4 battlecruisers. The Navarine and Ismail are the older class from 1911. 19,700 tons, 25 knots, 6-inch belt, 8 12-inch guns, 2 of them being in wing turrets, so really only 6 16 5-inch guns. If this had been a 1908 design, I would have said it was decent. For being a 1911 design, which is, for instance, after these 2 French ships were built, and well after, 3 years after I'd built Congress, this is kind of unacceptably poor. This whole gun layout, I mean, it's a reflection of Russia's backwards tech, I guess, but for being built in 1911, this is a really backwards gun layout, and the speed's not great either, nor is the armor. So I would say these are fairly bad. Not that they're useless, because honestly, no actual dreadnought or even semi-dreadnought type ship is yet at the point where it's useless. Even the oldest of them are only about 12 years old or 13 years old in terms of completion at this point. But the Navarines are definitely increasingly dated. However, their follow-ups are a little more promising looking. Kinburn, built 1914. Okay, the fact that they managed to build this just 3 years after the Navarines is quite something, but this is a 24-knot, 28,500-ton battlecruiser with 12 14-inch guns in 4 triple turrets, 22 4-inch and 4 3-inch guns, 7.5-inch belt. The one thing this doesn't correct about the Navarines is speed, which is still pretty low for a battlecruiser at 24 knots. This is not a lot faster. A lot of the dreadnoughts are only 3 knots slower than this, which means this isn't going to have a super easy time running away from them if it does get caught at close range or something. On the other hand, it has more firepower than most dreadnoughts. 12 14-inch guns is a lot. Obviously, they have this weird layout. I'm not quite sure how well the game takes into account the fact that these 2 turrets should be only able to fire at like these angles without blowing the ship's superstructure into pieces. And that actually does impact to a considerable extent how good a design this actually is. But if it can get you on a broadside, this has a hell of a lot of firepower. So I can't call it a bad design per se. It's just definitely got some flaws still. Its successor in turn was Ochakov at 32,400 tons. This doesn't correct everything, but it is clearly even better. This makes 28 knots, which is right up there with the best of them. It's got 4 triple turrets again, 24 5-inch, 4 4-inch. And it's got an 8.5-inch belt, which is stronger still, and not bad at all for a battlecruiser. This has speed, it has firepower, it doesn't have armor compared to a battleship, but it does have decent armor for a battlecruiser. Ochakov, I would say, is quite a formidable design, actually. I'm fairly impressed by Russia here. This is one of the strongest battlecruisers in the world, certainly of the earlier generation. Although, to be fair, it's a 1918 design. 1 year after that, the U.S. had this, which is pretty much superior in every way. Not number of guns, not number of barrels, but the caliber does make up for it. So maybe I'm praising it a little too much for how recently built this was, but it's still pretty formidable. Um, then, well, technically the U.S. would be next, actually. The U.S. has 5 battlecruisers actually in service, which is the 4th most in the world, less than Italy, although Italy's are all first-ish generation types. A good deal less than Germany and Britain, although it is catching up. The old generation U.S. battlecruiser is Congress from 1908, part of the Lexington class, but her sister Lexington was, of course, lost in the recent war with Britain. She makes 24 knots at 18,200 tons, 6 12-inch guns and 3 twin turrets, so she's a sort of semi-dreadnought type thing. 18 5-inch, 6 3-inch guns, 7-inch belt, 2-inch deck. All fairly respectable for her era, but they make her fairly obsolete now. And I am trying to phase her out of service basically as soon as the next couple of battlecruisers are finished for the US. That being said, against the other battlecruisers that were built in circa 1908, and even for a couple of years after that by a lot of countries, she's still fairly competitive, really. Especially any of those battlecruisers that technically have 8 12-inch guns, but actually have wing turrets or even cross-deck fire. She realistically has about as much firepower as them. So she's definitely not hopeless. And she was quite cheap for a battlecruiser. But I'm not going to claim she's brilliant. The modern American designs are Saratoga and Ranger from 4 years ago, which were much delayed in construction by the need to rush battleships first, but nonetheless turned out to be quite formidable. 28 knots, 29,000 tons, 8 14-inch guns and 4 twin turrets, 16 5-inch guns, 11-inch belt, 2-inch deck. I believe these were the first 14-inch gun-armed battlecruisers out there. I could be wrong. Let me check. 1916, none. None. No, Japan beat me to it, didn't they? Actually, none. Yes, Japan beat me to it by 3 years, in fact, which is fairly impressive with the Tsukuba class here, but Japan's has a fair bit less armor and speed. Nonetheless, it was definitely, and so did Russia by a couple of years. Okay, it wasn't the first then, but it was one of the earlier ones. Britain has only gotten it in 1917 and actually skipped 14-inch guns. Oh, damn, I haven't really looked at these before, but these are terrifying. Okay, and Germany actually had it in 1912. Yeah, I guess actually they're pretty much just. That's interesting. They were designed probably about as early, if not earlier, than any of those, but the production delays mean that ultimately, yeah, they're not. They're pretty much in the middle of the 14-inch gun generation, if not even towards the end of it, in terms of when they were actually commissioned. But between their speed, their firepower, and their armor, I would say they really are a pretty exemplary example of a 14-inch gun, second generation type battlecruiser. And there's not too much in the world that can actually go toe-to-toe with them. In point of fact, I would say the Saratogas are capable of fighting anything Austria-Hungary, Spain, Italy, or probably even Japan or Russia has in actual service. Maybe the Russian Ochakov is stronger, but it is less armored. But it's got a lot more firepower, 50% more firepower, basically, so you got to keep that in mind. Certainly anything France has got. Really only Germany, Britain, and Russia, maybe Japan, have ships that could actually fight these. And they're still not the state-of-the-art, because the state-of-the-art for the U.S. is the battlecruisers USS Constellation and Yorktown. 36,300 tons, 28 knots, 8 16-inch guns, 25-inch guns, 12-inch belt, and 2.5-inch deck, which is battleship armor from just a couple, really 1 generation, 2 generations ago, and is still what the AI is giving a lot of its battleships. Are these the first? No, these are actually not the first 16-inch gunned battle cruisers in the world. However, they are, as we'll see when we get to Britain in a moment, most definitely the first to have 16-inch guns without making hideous design compromises to get them. So I would be fairly comfortable in saying that the Constellation class are currently probably the most powerful battle cruisers in the world, ship for ship. Obviously, at 36,300 tons, they're outstandingly expensive for it, but that hasn't prevented the US from just about managing to pay for 4 of them, with Constitution and Independence soon to be completed as well. And they will be the core of an extremely powerful battlecruiser force, ship for ship, and honestly won't even be far behind the big power Germany and Britain by tonnage by the time they're finished. So then we do have Germany, which has the second most battlecruisers in the world with 9. And I was quite impressed by their designs back in 1910. Hopefully they've kept it up, especially since they're my ally in the war that just started. 5 out of those 9 are the Moltke class: Moltke, von der Tann, Goeben, Derflinger, and Seydlitz. Now these are very much first-generation battlecruisers, 20,600 tons, 24 knots, 8 11-inch guns in 4 twin turrets with cross-deck fire, 10 6-inch, 16 3-inch, 10-inch belt. Honestly, these were very good in 1910 when they had, the first 2 of them finished? Yeah. In 1910, these were very nice. 10 years later, they're very much showing their age. Their armor is still better than average for a battlecruiser, but it's not anything ridiculously outstanding. And the fact that they only make 24 knots and they only have 8 11-inch guns with cross-deck fire, they're not so obsolete as for me to tell Germany to just decommission them or anything. But they're not hugely better than, say, I think they probably are better than my Congress class, but not by, or my Lexington class that's just Congress now. But they're not hugely better. And any of the proper second or third generation battlecruisers will definitely rip a Moltke apart now. Even if they're the types with less armor, but the firepower advantage would just be too much. They followed that with Lutzow and Graf Spee in 1912-13, and these are 28,000 tons, 25 knots, 8 14-inch guns in 4 twin turrets, albeit one of them not superimposed, so that's a little weird. 8 5-inch guns, 8.5-inch belt. These are sort of more run-of-the-mill. The 8 14-inch guns, of course, is very nice. However, they dropped a little bit of the armor that Germany is famous for. It's still good, but not great anymore. Nor did they get up to the 28-knot type speed, so I would call these... And their secondaries are quite light, so I would call these... They're certainly more dangerous, like, don't get me wrong. They would beat the Moltkes easily, but for being 14-inch battlecruisers, they're definitely not the most dangerous 14-inch battlecruisers around. And then their most recent ships are Hindenburg and Mackensen, same class. And these, unfortunately... I was prepared to call them just bad for having 13-inch guns, but they're more weird than bad, I guess. I don't think I'm convinced. I don't think I'm sold. I really wonder if you could have gotten 8 15-inch guns for pretty much the same displacement cost, and I would have taken that in a heartbeat. But okay, what they have here is 30,800 tons. It makes 27 knots, which is respectable. 10 13-inch guns in 5 twin turrets. As you can see, 3 of them are centerline, 2 of them are set up on the wings for cross-deck fire, 14 6-inch and 12 3-inch guns, and a 12-inch belt. So, speed, good. Armor, outstanding for a battlecruiser. Firepower is the weird question. 13-inch guns are kind of a weird caliber to use at all. The cross-deck fire thing is very strange for a battlecruiser built in 1917. But if all goes well, it's got 10 guns that bear, albeit 13-inch guns. I'm not sold on this. I don't know if it's objectively terrible because the speed is pretty solid, the armor is pretty solid, the armament is not technically bad, but the cross deck fire thing combined with going down in gun size when almost everybody else is going up, it's weird. I don't love it. I'm actually beginning to think the German battlecruisers sort of peaked with the Moltke class. Obviously, those are the least effective now, but they've gone for the tonnage increases and the date increases, the advance of technology, they've sort of gone downhill. Now they are building Forced Bismarck, which is due in 3 years' time, and she's another 5,000 tons heavier and almost as heavy as a Constellation. So we'll see what they get out of that. Well, and the thing is, too, the Hindenburgs here are 30,800 tons, which means they are not light. They're more displacement than a Saratoga. And despite the slightly thinner belt, I'm fairly confident I would prefer a Saratoga class with just 8 14-inch guns to trying to get those 10 13-inch guns to all line up and fire on a target. Anyway, the largest battlecruiser fleet in the world, very clearly, belongs to Great Britain with 10 operational battlecruisers. They still have, despite some losses in the war with me, an advantage of over 50,000 tons from their nearest competitor. The oldest of them that's left is just a single incomparable that survived the war, indefatigable, 18,200 tons. Okay, apparently I can't even see her specifics, but 8 12-inch guns, 8 4-inch guns, 4 torpedo tubes. I believe she had a 6-inch belt, from what I remember. She doesn't actually make 18 knots, though. That's bugged. She probably made 25 knots, or 24 knots at least. And I think she had cross-deck fire. Oh, boy. I wish I could see the thing, but apparently she's being refit. I think she probably had cross-deck fire. She's not really a great design anymore. At best, they were about comparable to my Lexington class. I think the war actually proved that that was probably true, that they were just about comparable to the Lexingtons at best. At worst, probably not really worse, but they're yeah, probably about comparable to my Lexington class. Just technically they've got the extra guns, but the cross-deck fire makes it hard to actually use them. They've got slightly thinner armor and definitely weaker secondaries. They followed that, but there's only one of them left now, so they're not. She's not exactly a key part of Britain's battlecruiser force. The actual key at this point is the 5 New Zealands: HMS Inconstant, Illustrious, Tiger, Australia, and Lion. These are 20,600 tons, 25 knots, 8 12-inch guns in 4 twin turrets with cross-deck fire, 8 5-inch guns, and a 6.5-inch belt. These aren't very good either for the modern era. They're really only, they were a moderate improvement on the Incomparables, but at this point, 8 12-inch guns isn't a great armament, even if it wasn't restricted by cross-deck fire. And the 6.5-inch belt is really quite poor, even for a battlecruiser. Nor is the 25 knots anything special. There are a lot of second and third generation battlecruisers out there, including all of mine except Congress, that would pretty much run down and smash these with just ease, basically. So you can't call these very good anymore. And they weren't great even when they were built. I would have preferred the German Moltke class with, twice the armor. But it's the British way to build totally unarmored ships, apparently. They followed that up eventually, towards the end, well, actually, I think after our war was over, with Queen Mary, which is a proper second, third-ish generation dreadnought battlecruiser, 28,100 tons, 28 knots, 10 15-inch guns, 14 6-inch, 6 4-inch. However, 10 15-inch guns sounds, 28 knots is good. 10 15-inch guns sounds very impressive on paper. It's about the heaviest armament of any battlecruiser out there, pretty comparable to the 12-14s the Russians have or the 8-16s my latest have. However, as you can see, they're still using cross-deck fire on their battlecruisers for some reason, which means they've got 8 15-inch guns that can for sure bear in any direction, which is pretty damn powerful in itself. More than the 14 inches on my slightly heavier Saratogas. But they won't bring that last 2 barrels into action at a lot of angles. And the price to be that light with that much firepower in a weird configuration is the 6.5-inch armor belt. She's basically not armored. For all practical purposes, that belt is almost worthless against 14, 15, 16-inch type guns that she's surely expected to face. If this thing gets destroyed by flash fires or something in its first battle, that wouldn't even be remotely surprising. And wasn't the real Queen Mary one of the battlecruisers that got destroyed by flash fires at that? I'm going to look that up real quick, but I think it was. So, Britain has learned nothing from its historical mistakes, or just frankly from its mistakes in this game, because it lost several ships to flash fires during the war. And apparently that didn't teach them that armor was a good idea. Yes, Queen Mary was one of the battlecruisers that historically exploded at Jutland. This one's going to do the same thing, I think. That's just not enough armor. Not for a modern battlecruiser. They followed that up with the Invincible class of 3 so far. Invincible, Indomitable, and Princess Royal. All built in the last 3 years. And these would appear to take the principle of Queen Mary and turn it up to 11. They're 500 tons lighter. I believe the same secondary, tertiary armament. Yeah. The same armor belt, in fact. 6.5-inch, which is wildly inadequate again. Now, they might have a better deck, which would make them a little bit better at long range than I'm giving them credit for, but I wouldn't be too confident of it with how much they're squeezing into a ship of that size. They've had to sacrifice 2 knots of speed down to 26 knots, which means most of the other modern battlecruisers can run away from her. And the reward for all that is that her 10 15-inch guns are now 10 16-inch guns on this class, which means, of course, technically speaking, this is the most heavily armed battlecruiser in the world, albeit the last 2 barrels will have trouble getting into action at most range, or at a lot of angles. Let's put it bluntly. Yes, it's almost an extra 10,000 tons, but you can only build so many battlecruisers, and I would take a Constellation with literally most angles, the same firepower, more speed, and double the armor under pretty much any circumstances. I'm not at all sold on this. It does have a huge amount of firepower. I mean, it's the very traditional British approach to battlecruisers. It's a glass cannon. It's got a huge amount of firepower, but there are heavy cruisers being built right now with that much armor, or very close to it, 6-inch belts at least, and it's not even fast enough to escape some of its contemporaries if things do go wrong, so I'm not sold on Britain's huge investment into this class. But anyway, those are the battlecruisers of the world, and they are building... Actually, they're building 2 Courageous class, which, to be fair, those might be something frightening, because those are 39,000 tons. Either they've got, like, 18-inch guns, or they've actually put some armor on something with 10, 16-inch guns or something, which either way would be pretty terrifying. So we'll see what that comes to. But for now, that's the battlecruiser fleets of the world. Now, a look at the dreadnought fleets of the world, which are, of course, considerably larger and are currently the absolute kings of the ocean. Spain has 8 dreadnoughts, plus 2 under construction. They're older ones, the 2 San Leandro and San Fulgencio. These, of course, are not really dreadnoughts. They have an 11-inch belt. They make 17 knots, 19,600 tons. 12 11-inch guns in 6 twin turrets. Now, they do have 8 guns to a side, but the fact they only make 17 knots means almost every capital ship in the world now is faster than these. And the 11-inch guns are not really adequate for a modern dreadnought. And yet having to put 6 turrets on means they wasted a lot of weight. At this point, at least it still has firepower and has armor, so it's not useless, but it's not a good design. Obviously, Spanish technology limited them, but still. They followed that in 1912 with Trident and Reina Dona Isabel II. These at 18,000 tons are actually better, mostly despite being lighter. The 20 knots is much better. The 10, 12-inch guns. 2 triple turrets, 2 twin turrets with cross-deck fire are... It's definitely better from a weight-saving perspective. I'm not entirely sure it's actually better, but it's a little more conventional. The 8-inch belt is relatively small for a dreadnought, so again, this is kind of a poor design, really. I mean, what more do you expect from Spain? But it's kind of a... It's not helpless, but it's not good. They followed that up in 1913-14 with San Miguel and Numancia I. This is basically finally in 1913-14, they're getting to an actual first-generation dreadnought design, which is 3 centerline and 2 wing 12-inch turrets, 20 knots, 9-inch belt. This is basically indeed a baseline first-generation dreadnought, except built 7 years, at least 5 years too late. Still not 21 knots fully, but not too badly behind. And not that much armor, although not terrible. It's not terrible for a first-generation dreadnought. It's just built way too late in the timeline. The contemporary U.S. battleship being minimally 1913-14, minimally something like Delaware with significantly more armor and extra guns, and immediately afterwards something like Kentucky with 14-inch guns. So San Miguel's problematic. And then their most recent class, Almirante Oquendo and Alejandro I. Their biggest battleships, 26,900 tons, 23 knots, so they finally make a decent speed, 11.5-inch belts, so they're well armored, 8 12-inch guns, and 3 of them are, I believe, at the stern, and really weirdly laid out such that they can only shoot each other, basically. But I think that's not a problem in the game, probably, but... And 23 knots is actually too fast. I would surely have just taken more secondaries or more armor belt instead of the extra 2 knots compared to a standard dreadnought. But honestly, again, this is just a terrible design. Battleships by 1917? I was building 16-inch gun battleships by the time they finished those. Everybody was building at least 14-inch gun battleships, except maybe, like, Italy. You should not still be using 12-inch guns on your very latest ships in the year 1920. Even if their armor is all right and their speed is all right, the armament of this ship and its layout, both the size and the layout, are abysmal. This is a poor dreadnought for 1920. It's basically still a first-gen... It's them finally arriving at an actually decent first-generation ship, literally a full 10 years too late, in effect. Austria, and what are they building? They're building the San Francisco de something and Argonauta, same class, 27,600 tons. Well, it's only 700 tons heavier. We'll see what 700 tons and 6 years of technological development gets from Spain. Based on what I've seen so far, I'm not really prepared to be impressed. Austria-Hungary also has 8 dreadnoughts. Their earliest ones, Monarch and Kronprinz Erzherzog Rudolf. are much like the Spanish ones, not really dreadnoughts. At least they have a 10.5-inch belt, and they bear 8 12-inch guns to a side, so that's pretty solid actually, but they only make 16 knots, which means anything that they do happen to have more firepower than can almost certainly run away from them. Now, in the highly defensive perspective of the Austrian Navy in the Adriatic, maybe that's not such a bad thing, but I don't think it's a great thing. It's definitely not a great thing. It's still a serious problem. And they've wasted a lot of weight to get that gun layout. I'm not actually going to say it's terrible, especially for the purposes Austria-Hungary has, but it's certainly not brilliant either. They followed that in 1913 with Babenberg, which, wow, is a fascinatingly modern design, actually. I mean, 2 of those triple turrets are, I believe, at the stern, if I'm reading any of these right, which I think I am. But 22 knots, 11-inch belt, 3 triple 14-inch turrets, plus 14 6-inch, 18 3-inch. For being built in 1913, this is about as formidable and modern as almost anything I was building. I think my ships are, like, my Kentucky class is better, but not by a huge margin. This is a pretty good fighting ship. If you could actually get it into a line such that the stern thing isn't a problem, this would be a pretty excellent fighting ship, and it's really not. It's not got huge problems of any kind, you know? For Austria-Hungary building it in 1913, it's really not bad. They followed that with the 3 Erzherzog Franz Ferdinands, being Erzherzog Franz Ferdinand, Kronprinzessin Erzherzogin Stephanie, and Janos Hunyadi. These are also quite respectable at 20 knots with a 12.5-inch armor belt and 10 14-inch guns and 2 twin and 2 triple turrets. These are very comparable to, but honestly superior to, say, the Delaware that I was building at the time that used triple turrets for extra firepower. I would call this a very nice 14-inch dreadnought, actually. I'm very favorably impressed by what I've seen from Austria-Hungary here so far. And they followed that, finally, with the Erzherzog Karl class, along with Kaiser. Took them 5 years until 1919, but these make 30,000 tons. They've got 21 knots, 10 15-inch guns, 16 6-inch, 4 3-inch, 12-inch belt. I mean, unfortunately, these do have a clear flaw in that I just have literally no idea. Okay, we know for a fact they could do this armament layout, right? So why on earth did they not keep it? Why did they put this in the center, surrounded by superstructure? Probably no lines it can bear on at all. So that's an obvious flaw, and I just have to criticize them for it. But it's still got 10 15-inch guns, 2 twin, 2 triple turrets. It's still got a 12-inch belt, and it still makes 21 knots. So if it's not the absolute greatest battleship in the world for 1920, I can't say it's terrible. Although I do think this turret placement is a big problem, but so it doesn't get as many marks as these did, but it doesn't horrify. Well, it does. The turret placement horrifies me a little, but the battleship as a whole doesn't. Fortunately, they've moved on from that with the Budapest and Arpad, which are 2 separate classes they're building for some reason. And yet I suspect, well, they could be quite similar, or they could be wildly different for whatever reason, quirk of the AI, but we'll see. From there, we have Italy. Now, Italy built 2 battleships very early on, and that's it. They've put every other cent they've got into their battle cruisers and are continuing to do so. Well, no, they're not. They have finally started to build 2 more modern battleships recently. But for now, all they've got is Vittorio Veneto and Ruggiero di Loria. 20,200 tons, 21 knots, 10 12-inch guns, 10 5-inch, 8 3-inch, 9-inch. First generation dreadnought design with 3 centerline and 2 wing turrets. It's got your average dreadnought speed. Its armor is about probably average for what the AI puts on ships, but in my opinion, is pretty much below average. or below what it should have. It's not abysmal for when it was built in 1910. In fact, it's fairly solid. However, for it being, this is the only dreadnought Italy's got, or well, two of them, but this is the only design, the only class they have, and two of them, and it's 1920. Yeah, Italy's battle line might as well be non-existent against even like Austria-Hungary or Spain's, honestly, for just reasons of firepower and armor alone. Um, and it's not a budget problem. I don't know. I mean, their budget is not, it's sixth, but it's bigger than Japan, Spain, and Austria-Hungary's, and it's just hugely less battleships. They've just put it all into battlecruisers for some reason. Anyway, Japan has 10 battleships operational, which is not too shabby at all. The oldest is Kashima from 1911. She has your typical dreadnought 10-12-inch gun in 5 twin turret layout. 19 knots, 9.5-inch belt. Now, the flaw here is she only makes 19 knots, which means she's going to struggle to keep up with probably more modern dreadnoughts in her own fleet, plus the modern battle lines in general. But the 10-12-inch guns is good. The belt isn't horrible. I would call her below average, but she's not worthless. They followed that up just literally the same year. In fact, Kawachi was actually their first finished, apparently. But Satsuma and Kawachi, same class, 20,700 tons. And I'm trying to see what they've done other than take a knot of speed away for that extra 600 tons. Oh, they've added an actual secondary armament. That only had 14 3-inch. This has 12 6-inch and 6 4-inch guns. And the cost of putting an actual secondary armament on was that it lost a knot of speed and gained 600 tons, and I don't think it was worth it, to be honest. I think it's probably net worse for fighting other dreadnoughts because of that loss of speed. I don't think the secondaries are really necessarily worth it. They followed up 3 years later with Aki and Yashima, which, okay, they're building that one. This one not. This is a second-generation dreadnought with 25,900 tons, 20 knots, 10.5-inch belt, 12 14-inch, 14 6-inch, 8 5-inch guns. Unfortunately, the guns are very suboptimally laid out. 12 14-inch guns in no less than 6 twin turrets, and 4 of them are wing turrets. So, I mean, it's got 8 14-inch guns to a broadside, and it's got a 10.5-inch belt that makes 20 knots. So it's not horrible. It's not horrible. But its armor is average. Its speed is a little below average still. And yet not the same below average as the previous ships, so it's still going to cause a coordination problem. And it's got plenty of firepower, but it's just really poorly or weirdly laid out. I wonder if they were really having troubles getting 4 centerline turrets or what, but yeah. They then built Setsu, which is 28,100 tons, and this is probably what the previous class should have been. 22 knots, 12 14-inch guns in 4 triple turrets, 14 6-inch and 4 4-inch guns, 11.5-inch belt. This is a quite formidable dreadnought with good armor, good speed, good armament. I can't find... I mean, that's not how I would lay out the secondary armament, but okay. I can't find obvious flaws with it. I think the biggest problem... I mean, there are flaws, but no huge smoking gun flaws. It's pretty nice. They followed that with Fuji at 32,200 tons, and... Okay, this has 4 twin and 1 triple turret. It makes 23 knots, and those are 14-inch turrets. 26-inch and 4 4-inch guns, 11.5-inch belt. This is pretty formidable, but honestly, as you cross over, 30,000 tons, you might think about heavier than 14-inch guns. Also, to have just 1 triple turret, I don't know what exactly cost calculation drove that, but it's just weird, mainly. 5 centerline turrets, though. I mean, this thing has a lot of firepower, very respectable armor, very respectable speed. The turret layout is obviously a little weird, but not terrible. I think this thing is fairly formidable, but also kind of quirky, but not in a way that really hampers its combat performance. I think it's a pretty nice ship. Relatively pleased with what I've seen from Japan here, Fuji and Hyuga. Their latest, however, kind of go the other way with Nagato and Asahi 2 years after the Fujis. Yeah, this is terrible again, actually. 25. Apparently, they spent too much on the Fujis because they're back down to 25,000 tons and 20 knots for these. 9 14-inch guns and 3 triple turrets, which of course is less firepower than their last class. 18 6-inch, 10-inch belt. This is not going to cut it for 1920. The Fujis were a great ship, but this is a step completely in the wrong direction. Too slow again. Mediocre armor again, and the armament would have been good 5 years ago, but now is fairly mediocre for a brand new 1920 era ship. And it is. I mean, it was just finished this year. If I'd actually made the save in January 1920 like I thought I did, this wouldn't even be part of the review. But congratulations, Japan. You've gotten it included, and it's taking your grade down because it's not a good idea. Poorly designed ship there. And then we have France. France has 12 dreadnoughts, which amount to the largest. Well, okay. France will have 16 dreadnoughts, which will amount to the largest dreadnought fleet in the world. They only have 12 actually in service, which means I suspect this total includes building ships, which means I suspect that Britain actually has more tonnage right now. However, France has a dreadnought fleet that can fight with the absolute best in the world by tonnage. Let's put it that way. It's very large. Now, the oldest of them are the 4 Bouvet class, Bouvet, Carnot, Lorraine, and Republique from 1808 through 12. These are 18,900 tons. They only make 19 knots. An 11-inch belt is solid. The 12 11-inch guns in, 6 turrets with 4 wing turrets is very suboptimal weight-wise and just general layout-wise. I mean, the advantage of doing it this way as opposed to cross-deck fire is that you really do have 8 guns that bear to each side. Guaranteed. The problem is that it is a ton of extra weight. If they'd been able to do this exact ship, but on, 4 centerline turrets, it would probably only be literally like 16 or 17,000 tons, and that's a big cost difference. I can't say it's terrible for the time it was built, although actually it is a little slow. But it's kind of terrible for now. That speed problem combined with the inadequate size of the guns, it's not helpless. It's not worth scrapping. In a good way, I mean, but it's not very good against more modern dreadnoughts. After that, they built Patrie and Messina, which at 25,300 tons. Oh, these are kind of screwed up, though. Okay. They make 18 knots only, which is not really enough for a dreadnought. 12 13-inch guns in no less than 6 twin turrets. 4 of them are centerline. The other 2 are wing, and a 9.5-inch belt. Now, personally, flat out, I think they need to chop those wing turrets off and figure out how to get an extra 2 to 3 knots of speed and an inch of belt armor at least. I'm not at all convinced the extra firepower is worth losing that much speed and armor compared to a ship with just 8 13-inch guns in 4 centerline turrets. But apparently a French designer did. I'm not sure I agree. To be fair, at that exact moment, for about a year, it maybe made them more formidable. But now, as bigger and heavier ships are available, you're going to want something that can not fall behind your line or not get run down by those bigger and heavier ships that have more firepower. And this doesn't have the armor or the speed to do that. What they built after that was the 4 Charles Martel class, 1915, all commissioned in 1915. Charles Martel, Galois, Jena, and Suffren. And these... Oh, that's weird. Okay, and apparently they've built 2 different subtypes of it for some reason, but we'll get to that in a second. I'm assuming this was probably more like the base design. These are 30,000 tons, 20 knots, 11.5-inch belt, 9 14-inch guns, and 3 triple turrets, 24 5-inch guns, and 6 2-inch guns. The actual placement of the triple turrets is weird, but they're 14-inch guns, and there's 9 of them. It's not going to be terrible. You just do need to get very broadside on in order to bring most of them to bear. The armor is good. The speed is not great, but not so horrible as most of what France is building. I wouldn't call it a brilliant ship for 30,000 tons, because I'm not really convinced that a Saratoga at 1,000 tons less wouldn't beat it. Not a Saratoga. Actually, to tell you the honest truth, I'm not sure that a Saratoga-class battlecruiser wouldn't beat it most of the time. But what I meant was that the Kentuckies, at 500 tons more, I think would most likely beat it most of the time. Thanks to probably a more optimal gun layout and thicker armor and higher speed, which can give maneuverability improvements, of course. What's also weird is that some of them they've apparently, or 3 out of the 4 even now, they've apparently converted to 8 5-inch dual-purpose guns and 6 2-inch guns. So they've taken out 16 out of the 5-inch guns and replaced them with 8 dual-purpose guns. And I have no idea what else they even think they've gotten from that. They can't make radical changes to like freeboard or anything, so I have no idea why they did that, honestly. But that's sort of the absolute core of their fleet at the moment, really. But they do have 2 newer ships, which are the 1917 Normandy, not the heaviest, but the highest firepower ship in their fleet. 30,800 tons, makes 22 knots, 12 16-inch guns in 4 triple turrets. This is outstandingly well armed. 14 5-inch and 4 4-inch secondaries, tertiaries, 9.5-inch belt. The obvious issue with this ship is that its armor is not really adequate. Its own 16-inch guns will probably go through that 9.5-inch belt like butter at virtually any range. But, I mean, it's not like battle cruiser. Well, there are battle cruisers, including my own, with more armor than that, but most battle cruisers have less than that. The speed is actually good for once. The firepower is pretty insane. So, I mean, this is a scary battleship. I do think the armor will probably be a handicap to it in actual combat, but it's definitely scary, just on the basis of its speed and firepower. They followed that up with Voltaire, which is 31,100 tons, so a bit more, 20 knots, 9 16-inch guns in 3 triple turrets, 16 4-inch, 11.5-inch belt. Overall, I think I prefer this design to the Normandy, actually, just because of the extra armor, the more rational secondaries, probably. Am I crazy about that? Not really. Having 5 and 4-inch secondaries is weird, but although all those 5s are probably better, really. But the 2 knots of speed does hurt a bit, but I think it's worth it for the armor, honestly. Although I'd really try to get a way to bring this up to 21 knots, and then I think it would be a really nice ship. Also, the turret layout is kind of weird. Surely you'd at least go for a couple of super firing or something, but this isn't terrible either. It's just a little quirky. The latest things they're building will be Danton, Courbet, and then the even bigger Paris and France of a whole new class. Danton apparently is set to be pretty damn similar to the last Voltaire, just with because we managed to steal the data for this. An extra knot, but half an inch less belt armor, and a lot heavier secondaries, which is not a terrible series of compromises, but it's not going to make it hugely better either. So that takes us on to the United States. No, takes us to Russia. Russia has 13 battleships, which is the second most out of anyone in the world for battleships actually in commission, in fact, behind only Britain. And they're right up there. I mean, these four navies are all very close in terms of battleship tonnage. Russia's 5 out of those 13, however, are the Johann Zlatoust class. Zlatoust, Cesarevich, Retvizan, Imperator Pavel I, and Poltava. And these are old and not useless, but definitely old. 19 knots, 18,500 tons, 12 11-inch guns, 9.5-inch belts. Obviously, we've seen a lot of ships like this. The speed is too low, the armor is mediocre, and this gun layout, while technically working, is wasting a lot of weight. That's not really Russia's fault, because they probably didn't have 4 centerline turrets when they built this. Possibly not even 3. But it's definitely not a fantastic ship. It's not terrible or worthless even now, but it's not fantastic. Interestingly, Russia has built all of its ships in just 3 classes, as they follow those 5 up with the 4 Imperator Nikolai I, Imperator Alexander the second, no, third, Imperator Peter Veliki, and Petropavlovsk, 1914 to 16. Now these have 28,100 tons, 24 knots, 10 12-inch guns in 5 twin turrets, 14 6-inch, 8 3-inch, and a 13-inch belt. So what do these do right? Outstanding speed for a dreadnought, more than it really needs, to be honest, but outstanding. I mean, it can't be a negative thing. Well, wasted weight it can be, but outstanding armor, 13-inch belt. What does it do wrong? Armament. Yes, it's got 8 12-inch guns that bear maybe 10 at the right angle. It was built in 1914. Most everybody else was already moving up to 14-inch guns by that point, at least out of the major powers. And now its armor is very impressive, as is its speed. But it's just a little undergunned, really, ultimately. 14-inch guns are actually a lot heavier in terms of explosive delivered than 12-inch guns. I forget by what margin, but it's not just like a seventh or whatever you would expect it to be. It's more like probably 50% plus or something, because it's more exponential. So it's not a terrible ship, if only because of its speed and armor, but it's not brilliant. And then most recently they've built the 4 Imperatrica Ekaterina Velikaya. That, and then Mikhail Kutuzov, Dvenitsa Apostolov, and Evstafi. Now these, again, make 23 knots, 31,000 tons, 10 14-inch guns in 5 twin centerline turrets, 16 6-inch and 2 4-inch guns, 11-inch belt. You know, these are really quite nice. They're not... I have better battleships, but they're fast enough to run away from most of everybody else's battleships. Their armor is not terrible. Their armament is quite strong overall, I would say. I mean, if I was going to go for 10 guns, I'd probably just go for 2 triple turrets instead of an extra twin turret. And I think it would be more weight efficient slightly, but there's nothing... I mean, there's a little bit of redundancy provided by having an extra turret, though, so I can't say it's objectively wrong. It's not a bad ship. In fact, it's quite a nice ship for the most part. It now has the opposite. I mean, it's a little under... It's not really under armored, just compared to how the AI usually builds. It's pretty well armored. Just, I would put more armor on it. It's faster than it really needs to be, considering only one other Russian dreadnought can keep up with her, I believe. No, oh wait, all the Imperator Alexander. I guess. No, actually. I guess it's not. Russia just has a really fast dreadnought line, except for the first five, which are really going to get left behind and ripped to pieces in a fleet engagement, presumably, but that's Russia's problem. They're also now building. After three large classes in a row, they've completely ruined it now as they're building three different ships for their next three. Georgi, Pobal Thonos something, Andrei Pervozvany, and Borodino, which are all in the 29 to 34,000 ton range. They're not going to be hugely improved or different from these, probably. We'll see. Then from Russia, the United States. The U.S. now has 10 battleships in service, which amounts to actually still a significantly smaller fleet than Germany, Britain, France, and Russia's, but I do think, in terms of how advanced they are, that the U.S. has a very, very good chance in a fleet engagement against any of those four at this point. The oldest ship in the fleet, obviously, is North Carolina, and she is the problem ship, as she only has six 12-inch guns, 25-inch, 12-3-inch. 12-inch belt, 2.5-inch deck, good armor, 21 knots, fine. The six 12-inch guns is the obvious issue. There are some older dreadnought type designs that I saw it more on battle cruisers actually. I'm not quite sure there's any dreadnoughts that do only have six bearing guns in the game. Certainly not in real life, but in the game. And so that's her hamstring. On the other hand, she's light and cheap relatively, and her armor and speed are good enough, so she can still contribute with the fleet and be more than just a floating target. She's just not adding as much as others would be. The first proper, definite dreadnoughts, then USS Oregon and USS South Carolina. These make 21 knots, 24,100 tons, 8 12-inch guns and 4 twin turrets, 16 5-inch, 16 3-inch, a 12-inch belt, a 2-inch deck, well armored, average, good speed, unproblematic, very typical and decent armament for their era. If I might be so bold to myself, I would say there's nothing wrong with these ships whatsoever. There's nothing absolutely brilliant about them, certainly not in the modern era where there's 14 and 15 and 16-inch battleships wandering around. But for 12-inch battleships, they're about as good as anything out there. And they were followed up before I had 14-inch guns with the 3,000-ton heavier Delaware, 27,100 tons, 20 knots, which I don't know if I did that intentionally or if I missed that by accident or if she just turned out to be slower than intended. I don't remember anymore, but 12-inch belt, 2-inch deck, same armor, same secondaries, I think, or maybe, yeah, same secondaries. The only real improvement is that she's got a couple of triple instead of twin turrets. For all practical intents and purposes, she's basically an Oregon with slightly more firepower. And then they were succeeded, the 12-inch first generation battleships were succeeded by the second generation, Kentucky, Rhode Island, Georgia, and Indiana. All finished in 1914, and they ended up being sort of the heroes that finally allowed us to break the British blockade of our coast in our big war with Britain. These are 30,500 tons. They make 21 knots. They've got 8 14-inch, 14 5-inch, 12 3-inch guns, a 13-inch belt, and a 2.5-inch deck, which I'm pretty sure is as well armored as any ship in the world, basically, still. They make decent speed. They have a very respectable firepower. There are definitely ships with more firepower, but it's not, well, even at the time they were finished, there were ships with slightly more firepower. I don't think there were any with bigger than 14-inch guns just yet. I'd have to go back and check, but I don't think so. Obviously, there are now ships with 15 and 16-inch guns that are more powerful, but not, well, the 12, 16-inch gun type ships are definitely more powerful, but they also mostly sacrifice layout or armor or are just much larger. I am quite satisfied with the Kentuckies as very strong 14-inch gun battleships. That being said, the very latest of the U.S. fleet, USS Minnesota and USS Washington, 39,200-ton battleships with 10 16-inch guns in 2 twin and 2 triple turrets, plus 24 5-inch. They make 24 knots. They have a 14-inch belt and a 3-inch deck. So their speed is good, is what you would expect from a dreadnought, and is better than what a lot of the AI has built, although some of them have built faster for weird reasons. But I would say their firepower, genuinely, in terms of what they actually bring to bear, is about as good as anything else that I've seen in the world so far. Yeah, France had these with 12 16-inch guns, so this is just slightly better, to be fair, but much thinner armor. The Minnesotas are very competitive in terms of firepower with anything that exists in the world. Their armor, I'm fairly certain their armor is the best out of any ship in the world, full stop. I could be wrong. I can't see the full details of the AI armor, and it's not reliable even if I could. But I think that this is an extremely good modern battleship all the way around. I don't think there's any major problems with this either, other than that it costs a lot, but that's just how I build ships for the most part. So that brings us on to Germany. And there's one more Minnesota USS New Jersey building, which will bring the U.S. up to 10 battleships after I actually intend probably to decommission or at least mothball North Carolina once New Jersey's finished. Just because with only 6 guns, she's not fully a liability exactly, but she costs a fair bit to maintain still, and she's increasingly definitely the most obsolete out of our battleships. But anyway, that brings us to Germany, which has 12 dreadnoughts. The oldest two, Konig and Kaiserin from 1908. This is a very classic dreadnought layout. 10 12-inch guns in 5 twin turrets with 3 centerline and 2 wing. 21 knots, 9.5-inch belt, plus 10 3-inch guns for secondaries, which is very weak, but this is pretty archetypal. I mean, it's got the speed, it's got the armament of any first-generation dreadnought. It's a little thin on the armor, but not hideously so, perhaps. It's also light on the secondaries, but, modern battleships fight more and more with their primaries. Only, unless against destroyers. So it's not terrible. In fact, it's solid. It's just average, basically. They followed that with the 4 Preußen class of 1913. Preußen, Bayern, Weissenberg, and Elsass. Now, these have 10 12-inch guns with 3 centerline and cross-deck fire, which, to be fair, is undoubtedly an upgrade from the wing turrets. Not as good as having them all centerline, but an upgrade from the wing turrets that didn't have cross-deck fire. 20 knots, 12-inch belt, 14 6-inch, 8 3-inch, so it's got a heavier secondary armament. It's got a better laid-out main armament. Not perfect, but better. It's got heavier armor and very good armor. I wish they had managed to squeeze the last knot into it, but I can't find anything terrible to say about it. Except that by 1913, maybe people were starting to move to 14-inch guns, and certainly the last one of them finished in 1916 really should have had better guns by that time. But it's not a horror show of a ship. It's very German, really, to have armor more than guns. And they followed that up with 5 Schlesiens, 1917 and 16. Schlesien, Pommern, Saarringen, Würth, and Wittelsbach. Now these... Okay. These still have 10 14-inch guns, 14 6-inch... Or no, these now have 10 14-inch guns, but the same layout, with 3 centerline and then 2 in cross-deck fire. 14 6-inch, 8 3-inch, 20 knots, 12.5-inch belt. They're very well armored, much like my ships. They're a little slower, but 20 knots is fine, really, if that's the standard speed the German battle line is going for, which it seems like it is. As long as they're not wasting tonnage on any of their significant ships, 20 knots with the others, then it's not that big a deal that they've got 20 knots instead of 21. The major issue I have with this, the speed is fine, the armor is excellent, the firepower is quite solid. The major issue I have is that they're still using cross-deck fire in 1917, 16, whatever. That's kind of odd. Um, I mean, at that point, if I wanted 10 guns, I could and did and would have gone with 4 turrets, with a couple of them being triples, and that would have much more reliably brought them all to bear and been lighter. So Germany was either lacking something technologically or just chose this design for weird reasons, but it's not optimal to still be using cross-deck fire in 1916. That said, it's not a terrible battleship. Their very latest, then, is Mecklenburg. Now, it's not promising already, I can tell you. Okay. Mecklenburg's main problem as a battleship is that she's not a battleship, alright? She's 29,100 tons. She's got 12 14-inch guns in 4 triple turrets, which is the strongest armament of any German ship to date. Albeit, she's got this weird thing where 2 of them are going to blast her own bridge off, but I'm not sure how well the game accounts for that again, so hard to say. 16 6-inch and 4 4-inch guns. The fundamental issue, very obviously, is that she makes 26 knots, but she only has an 8.5-inch armor belt, which means that for whatever reason, this is a battle cruiser. It's, in fact, very clear-cut, and quite, you know what? I'm not even going to, well, I have to judge this as a battleship because it's going to be thrown into the line of battle as a battleship because that's what the game thinks she is. But I'd tell you honestly, as a battle cruiser, this is quite a solid design overall. Even for a battle cruiser built in this year, it's a little light on the armor and a little low on the speed, but the firepower is quite nice. As a battleship, first of all, it should probably have bigger than 14-inch guns, but Germany always kind of lags on that. It's too fast because all of the other battleships in the whole German fleet are significantly slower. And it's either going to be stuck with them at 20 knots, which makes all that extra speed a waste, or it's going to go out on its own and probably get battered by a whole line of enemy battleships that do stick together. And it's not got enough armor to be a battleship. So this has ended up being a really weird ship, and I don't like it at all for the reason that it's a battle cruiser that's still slightly too slow and under-armored, classed as a battleship. So it's going to have to fight battleships. The AI is going to use it to fight battleships, and it's going to die. So, yeah, not optimal. And last, but most definitely not least, we reach Great Britain, which has 15 battleships in service. I suspect the largest fleet actually in service right now. Although, it's hard to say how... I think probably because France has 4 building and Britain only has 1, that Britain has more tonnage right now. And same with Germany and Russia, which are also very close. Britain definitely has the most tonnage overall, with 736,000 between its battleships and battlecruisers, although it's hilarious how large a proportion of its fleet tonnage that is compared to its total lack of heavy cruisers. And, well, it's actually got a good light cruiser and destroyer force too, though, but Britain's gone a little overboard on battlecruisers, to tell you the truth. Germany, Britain, and France are all, Germany, France, and Russia are all very close to it in battleship numbers and tonnage. And that's because Britain has pulled, to be fair, not that far. Britain and Germany are really actually closer to each other than I am to either of them, probably, in terms of just tonnage and numbers. But I'm pretty confident in the quality of my ships at this point. But anyway, yeah, Britain and Germany have pushed each other awfully hard. But Britain has more battlecruisers than Germany, and it has way more than France and Britain, which have just about kept up in battleships. Anyway, Britain's 15 battleships are Empress of India herself, the original. I refer to dreadnoughts. The game refers to dreadnoughts. In this universe, they'd be Empress of India's, because this is the first. She makes 20 knots. She's 19,400 tons. She has 8 12-inch guns. To be fair, it's only 2 centerline and 2 wing, which means she actually only brings 6 to bear to either side. 24 4-inch and an 11.5-inch belt. She's really just like so close to being an actual dreadnought, and yet isn't really quite. She's a turret short. She's a knot short. Her armor is good, but not great, but good. I suspect a lot of Britons actually have less. She wasn't terrible for when she was built. She's not great now. Sort of in the same position as my it's North Carolina. Yeah, as my North Carolina, where she was a bit of a stopgap and now isn't great. But at the time she was commissioned, she was the very best battleship in the world, of course. She fought against us twice and took heavy damage at Onslow Bay. Apparently, mainly from our pre-dreadnoughts, although one dreadnought might have been involved. Honestly, she's done all right for herself in the war and all, but she's pretty obsolete now. They followed her up with 5 Benbow class. I could be wrong, but I think there might have once been more than 5, and we sank 1 or 2, but there's 5 now anyway. Bellerophon, Collingwood, Centurion, Repulse, and Royal Oak. 19,900 tons, 21 knots, 8 12-inch guns with 2 centerline and 2 in a cross-deck fire arrangement. 12 6-inch, 6 4-inch, and a 9.5-inch belt. Obviously, the problem with the Bellerophons is fairly thin armor for a battleship. I mean, thinner than any of mine, and a little on the not horrible by the AI standards, but on the weak side. And then, of course, the cross-deck fire thing, which means a lot of the time she really only has 6 guns firing, except at the perfect angles. So it's hard to say if these are really clear-cut any better than my South Carolina, North Carolina, that is. I'm not actually convinced they are. They're not absolutely horrible, but they're not brilliant either. Actually, let me, there's a button here somewhere for, is it in the almanac, actually? Yeah. Yes, they lost 2 Benbows during the war, actually. 1 to the Japanese and 1 to us at New Brunswick. And they lost Empress of India's sister ship off the southeastern seaboard, plus a Resolution. They lost 4 in total, 3 of them to us. And they lost 1 of the New Zealands and all 4 of Incomparable's sister ships out of the ones that survived. So that's part of the reason. That is, to be fair, part of the reason why Germany, France, and Russia are so close to Britain is that they've lost 3 dreadnoughts and 5 battlecruisers in the last war they fought. But anyway, after Benbow, they built Anson, which was their first, I believe the world's first, actually. 2nd generation battleship with 14-inch guns. 26,300 tons, 22 knots. 10 14-inch guns in 5 twin turrets and an 11.5-inch belt. This was a scary ship at the time, and she still really holds up pretty well, actually. Her armament layout is about as good as you're going to get, probably with 5 twin turrets. You could probably do a little better, but not in 1912 or whenever. Her speed is good. Her armor is really pretty good. Really, her secondaries are pretty weak, but a pretty strong dreadnought all around is HMS Anson. And she only fought once against us for whatever reason, and then kept oscillating around, but she did all right. They followed that with the Resolution class, which is even bigger, and they lost the actual Resolution during the war, their biggest loss during the war, by 10,000 tons, more or less. It's the only 2nd generation ship they lost in the war, but her sister Magnificent still exists. 29,100 tons, 21 knots, 12 14-inch guns in 4 triple turrets, 14 6-inch, 4 4-inch, 10-inch belt. Honestly, I mean, the achievement they had is they've managed to fit, instead of 10 guns in 5 turrets. They've gotten 12 guns in 4 turrets, which is definitely an upgrade. The cost, however, is apparently an inch and a half. Yeah, an inch and a half of belt armor and a knot of speed. Now, 21 knots is still fine. 10-inch belt is average at best, probably below. Her firepower is very good, but, maybe if she'd had an 11.5-inch belt, her sister wouldn't have died in the war. Who knows? She did die to a flash fire, too, I think. It's hard to tell how much they're under armoring their turrets. You can just guess based on the belt, but they probably are. In any case, it's not actually a bad battleship. I'm not convinced it's really that much better than Anson, though, for the extra tonnage. They followed that with their first 15-inch battleship, HMS Rodney of 1914. 31,800 tons, 21 knots, 10 15-inch guns in 5 twin turrets, 16 6-inch, 2 4-inch, 10.5-inch belt. Layout-wise, this is more like an Anson with bigger guns, but also loses an inch of armor and a knot of speed. There's nothing hugely wrong with Rodney, except that her armor is thinner than I'd prefer. But again, it's quite a dangerous ship for sure. Cost plenty to make it, of course, but Britain can afford it. And they followed that with 3 Camperdowns, HMS Camperdown, Majestic, and Jupiter, 1916, all. Fortunately, the war ended before we had to fight these because I wasn't looking forward to it. These are 33,200 tons, 21 knots, 12 15-inch guns in 2 triple and 3 twin turrets. Now, that is a little odd. I would have really tried to just get 4 triples if possible, or else honestly saved weight or added armor by cutting the extra twin out. But it's a lot of firepower that it results in for sure, even if the middle turret really needs to be directly on to bear, you would think. However, the speed is fine. The armor is pretty good, actually, and the firepower is excellent overall. So, I mean, a minimum of 8 guns that should bear most angles. So, Camperdowns are quite dangerous ships, actually. And really, compared to our Kentucky class, which was probably the closest contemporary, almost certainly better. A bit less armored, but not horribly so. And definitely more firepower, so I'd be quite concerned about the Camperdowns in a fight, yeah. Of course, our very newest ships, the Minnesotas, could definitely take them, but that's not the question, is it? That said, they haven't exactly improved on the Camperdown design just yet. In fact, it's still their heaviest battleship class. For whatever reason, they followed them, maybe budgetary reasons, needing to get more battleships, but they followed them with the 500-ton lighter Renown, which makes 24 knots and has a 12-inch belt, so she's got very good speed, very good armor. But interesting. So actually, this is the direct answer to my question I asked of what could you do if you cut out that extra 15-inch turret? And the answer is, you still have 10 15-inch guns, which is a hell of a lot of firepower, and you can make 24 knots with a 12-inch belt. I'd probably go on for less of the speed increase and more of an armor increase. If this thing made 21 knots with a 13-inch belt, it would be actually terrifying to me. But as it is, honestly, the 24 knots maybe is actually even better, because this thing is almost like a battle cruiser, or like a battleship hunter. Like, it sacrifices just a little bit of armament, but it's got great armor and great armament still, and it's significantly faster, enough faster than the average battleship. That the main problem with this thing is that I assume it was quite expensive. It cost more than any of my Kentuckys, more than anything other than my Minnesotas, which are, of course, newer and more powerful, but it's quite a dangerous battleship. It's one I could probably see myself building, and yeah, I like it. However, it was after that that they really kind of did go downhill. They built in 1919 HMS Mars, which somebody decided going faster than the average battleship was a great idea, so they kept 23 knots, even though that's a knot less even, but they cut the armor back to 10.5-inch belt, And the armament is 4 triple 14-inch turrets, which is definitely, I would say, still a downgrade in firepower from 10 15-inch. 14-inch shells just don't quite have the stopping power that 15-inch do. And the loss of armor especially, I'm not as impressed by this. Now, obviously, it's lighter and cheaper by 2,600 tons, but I'm not too impressed by the design of HMS Mars here, really. I think this is a step in the wrong direction. Less armor, and probably less firepower, and less speed even, so there's really nothing that's better about this. And then they really went backwards with HMS Redoubtable here. This is an extremely budget battleship, and it's not good. 23,000 tons, 21 knots. Now, alright, credit's where it's due. They've managed to stuff 8 15-inch guns into 23,000 tons, which is not a lot of tonnage at all for that much firepower. But it's 2 triple and 1 twin turret, with the twin in the middle in a bad location where it's only going to bear at certain angles. Plus 18 5-inch, 4 3-inch. The speed is fine. The armor is mediocre, but not horrible. The armament is still sufficient that she would be better than most of, like, I mean, an early 23,000 ton type battleship like my Oregons would almost certainly lose to her, to be fair. So I can't say she's absolutely abysmal necessarily, but it's the question of what is she going to be facing in 1920. If she was built in 1912, despite the weird armor, a gun layout, she'd still be quite nice. But being built in 1920, the latest thing she's going to be facing is like the Minnesota class. Or even, well, these German Mecklenburgs are not that scary, actually. But whatever these French Paris and Dantons are, with slightly thicker armor and 16-inch guns. That belt and her gunpowder is not that great. I'm not impressed by Redoubtable. But anyway, that's going to be a wrap on the fighting ships of the world in 1920. Britain is still at the top, although I think they've made a few questionable decisions in terms of building, but so is everyone else. France, Russia, and Germany are all challenging them pretty closely for the battleship crown after the damage we did to them in the last war. Frankly, we're not quite as far as behind as the tonnage statistics would have you think, because I do think that ton for ton our fleet is pretty damn powerful still, and especially in the battle cruisers where we're closer than the tonnage would indicate. Britain's battle cruiser force in particular, I question, actually, because they oscillate wildly between very obsolete or like very early and weakly armored and pretty obsolete, right up to enormous firepower, but weird gun layout and extremely thinly armored still. So they're building extreme glass cannons still compared to everybody else's battlecruisers. However, our imminent problem, of course, is Russia, as you'll know if you've been watching the main parts. I am pretty impressed by the Russian battleships. These are not too shabby at all. Not too terrifying, but not too shabby. And their very latest battle cruisers like Kinburn and Ochakov are pretty good as well. Although some of their older things like Jean Zlatoust and even the Imperator, I mean, these are well armored, but their guns are weird. I think we should be able to beat Russia pretty comfortably in the end, but they should be able to make a fight of it at least. We'll see what happens there. Anyway, as I was saying, that is All the World's Fighting Ships 1920. Thank you, everybody, for watching. Next special will be in 1930, of course. See you next time, and have a nice day.